A millionaire CEO had gone 2 decades without so much as a fleeting touch from a woman, until his new assistant shattered that unbroken streak. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Sit back and enjoy. The tension at Smith Enterprises was palpable that morning. The usually bustling hallways hummed with hushed conversations and sideways glances. "Did you hear?" one administrative employee whispered. "Yes, Hank Smith hired a new assistant, but does she know about the rule?" "I doubt it. This is going to be a disaster." The rule in question was as simple as it was unyielding. Hank Smith never touched women. Not a handshake, not an incidental brush in passing, nothing. Over the years, female employees had come to accept this quirk. Some dismissed it as billionaire eccentricity, others speculated wildly about some deep, unspoken trauma. Regardless of the reason, one thing was certain: no one dared to invade his space. But Solene Morris, his newly appointed personal assistant, was blissfully unaware of this unspoken boundary. It was her first day, and though she couldn't quite put her finger on it, something about the office atmosphere felt off. The way people looked at her was an odd mix of pity and fascination, as though she were a lamb unwittingly stepping into a lion's den. "Morris!" The sharp call of Emma, the executive secretary, snapped her out of her thoughts. "Mr. Smith needs a tie. Grab one and take it to him now." Solene blinked. "A tie? He has a meeting in 10 minutes. Move!" "Right, just a tie, no big deal," she thought, hurrying toward the executive dressing room. But as soon as she flung open the cabinet, her simple task took an unexpected turn. There were at least 50 ties neatly arranged inside. "Okay. What color would a cold, untouchable CEO wear?" she muttered, sifting through them. She hesitated between navy blue, black, and gray before panicking and scooping them all up in her arms. With her hands full of silk and fine fabric, she marched toward the CEO's office, determined to get this over with. She knocked. "Come in." Taking a steadying breath, Solene stepped inside. Hank Smith stood by his desk, adjusting his shirt cuffs with the same calm authority one might expect from a man who had already solved a corporate crisis before breakfast. At the sight of her, his gaze flickered to the pile of ties in her arms. "What is that? Ties?" she said, stopping in front of him. "All of them?" she nodded. "I wasn't sure which one you'd prefer, so I brought options." For a moment, Hank simply stared at her before exhaling, as if summoning patience he didn't possess. "Just give me one." Solene let the ties spill onto the desk and randomly plucked one to hand to him. Hank took one glance at it and arched an eyebrow. She followed his gaze and, to her horror, realized she'd picked one adorned with tiny rubber duck prints. "Oh!" She quickly snatched it back. "Not that one!" Rifling through the pile, she selected another and handed it over. Navy blue. Hank gave a small nod of approval. She let out a breath. Mission accomplished. Now all she had to do was exit quietly. But, just as she turned to leave, she noticed something that made her pause. Hank was tying his tie the wrong way. She blinked. Then again, he was absolutely butchering the fabric, yanking and twisting it like he was trying to exorcise a ghost rather than dress for a high-profile meeting. This is a crime against corporate fashion, she thought. Before she could stop herself, her hands moved instinctively. "Wait, you're doing it wrong. Let me..." And then she touched him. The instant her fingertips brushed against the skin of his neck, Hank froze. Every muscle in his body went rigid beneath her touch. The air between them shifted, thick with an almost tangible weight. Then, no. Hank jerked back as though he'd been burned. Solene's eyes widened. "Oh my God, what just happened?" He stared at her as if she had just narrowly missed stabbing him. "You touched me?" Yeah? "I was fixing your tie." She frowned, baffled by his extreme reaction. "Never do that again." "Okay, relax. I'm not radioactive, you know." Hank ran a hand over his neck as if trying to erase the sensation of her touch, his breathing uneven, his stormy gaze still locked onto her, dark, tormented, and unreadable. "You don't understand," he said, his voice taut with restrained emotion. "Then make me understand," Solene shot back, crossing her arms, because honestly, none of this made any sense. Hank's fists clenched at his sides, as if he were battling something within himself. "I can't be touched." She arched an eyebrow. "Can't?" What do you mean? Do you explode, turn into a frog? This isn't a joke, he snapped. The sharp edge in his voice made her pause. It wasn't just frustration, it was something deeper, desperation, real, raw, and utterly unguarded. His gaze flickered away, his jaw set so tightly it could have been carved from stone. Just don't do it again. Solene hesitated, uncertain how to respond. She had never encountered someone who reacted so severely to a simple touch. But as she studied his face, she saw something beyond irritation. It wasn't anger, it was fear. Letting out a slow breath, she raised her hands in surrender. Fine, no touching. Hank's shoulders loosened. Just slightly, but the tension still lingered in his posture. You can go, he said brusquely. Solene rolled her eyes. Whatever you say, boss, but one day I'm going to figure out why this freaks you out so much. With that, she turned on her heel and walked out, still completely clueless about what had just transpired. Behind her, as the door clicked shut, Hank let out a shaky breath. His fingers instinctively drifted to the spot where she had touched him. His pulse was still racing. This had never happened before. For 2 decades, his body had instinctively rejected any physical contact from a woman. Yet, for some inexplicable reason, her touch lingered. And that changed everything. The moment Solene stepped into the main office, she felt dozens of curious eyes locked onto her. The entire floor was practically buzzing with silent intrigue. She exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. Great. Day 1, and I'm already the office gossip. Milo Turner, the finance director, appeared beside her, casually sipping his coffee. In his mid-30s, Milo had the air of a man who had seen it all and was deeply entertained by the spectacle unfolding before him. So, you survived, he quipped. Solene shot him a look. Why does everyone keep saying that? Milo leaned against her desk, smirking. Because no one touches Hank, ever. She frowned. Okay, now this is getting weird. It's a rule. He doesn't do physical contact. No handshakes, no brushes in passing, nothing. Solene let out a dry laugh. Well, he could have warned me before having a meltdown. Milo's eyes widened. Wait, you actually touched him? Technically, yes, but in my defense it was his fault. He was butchering his tie and my need for order took over. Milo stared at her as if she had just confessed to slapping the queen. You put your hands on Hank Smith? I fixed his tie, the man let out a low whistle, shaking his head in disbelief. Congratulations, Solene, you just broke 20 years of protocol. She rolled her eyes. Oh, please, no one dies from an accidental touch. Little did she know, inside his office, Hank Smith wasn't thinking about reports, numbers, or market forecasts. He was still reeling, his hands gripped the edge of his desk as he stared blankly at the glowing screen before him. The neatly organized figures, the lifeblood of his empire, blurred together, utterly meaningless. He swallowed hard and ran a hand along his collar where his tie sat perfectly in place. That was what unsettled him the most. He should have felt discomfort. He should have felt revulsion. He should have felt something, anything. But there was nothing. And that terrified him. The last time someone had touched him like that, 20 years ago, it had been a disaster. Since then, his body had learned to reject all contact. But now, Solene had shattered that barrier with nothing more than an absent-minded gesture. Why was she different? Hank abruptly stood, pushing his chair back and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. His reflection stared back at him. A man who, for the first time in years, didn't understand himself. This had to be a fluke, an anomaly. There was only one way to be sure. 2 hours later, Solene was focused on a report when the intercom buzzed. Mr. Smith wants to see you in his office, his secretary informed her. Solene stiffened. Again? Yes. And bring the investor meeting report. He wants you to hand it to him directly. She hesitated, then grabbed the file. Directly into his hands? That's what he said. Her brows furrowed. What kind of power move was this? Still, she made her way to his office. When she entered, Hank was standing behind his desk, his expression unreadable as always. Here's the report, Mr. Smith, she said, stepping forward. He extended his hand. She hesitated. A few hours ago, he had acted as though her touch had burned him. Now, he was willingly reaching out? Cautiously, she handed him the file. And then it happened again. The moment their fingers brushed, Hank tensed. It was brief, nearly imperceptible to an outsider, but inside it felt like a seismic shift. A jolt ran through his system, his heart skipping an unsteady beat. Trying to recover, he grabbed the papers too quickly, causing one of the sheets to slip and flutter to the floor. Damn it! Solene instinctively bent down to retrieve it at the exact same time Hank did. The result? A forehead-to-forehead collision. It wasn't hard, but it was enough to freeze them both in place, mere inches apart. Solene held back a laugh. If this is some kind of experiment, congratulations. You passed. Hank cleared his throat and straightened, quickly gathering the papers. That wasn't a test. Oh, sure, she teased, because bumping heads is a well-known business strategy. He ignored her, turning back to his desk as if nothing had happened. Solene smirked. Mr. Smith? Yes? Are you nervous? His gaze flicked up, piercing and cold. I don't get nervous. She tilted her head, eyes twinkling with mischief. Then you won't mind if I do this? She raised her hand ever so slightly, as if she were about to touch him again. Hank stepped back so fast he nearly knocked over his chair. The silence stretched between them. Then Solene burst out laughing. Wow, for someone who doesn't get nervous, that was a pretty dramatic reaction. Hank shot her a withering glare. That's enough for today, you can leave. Still grinning, she gave him a mock salute and strolled out, leaving Hank staring after her. Completely, utterly unsettled, Solene walked out of the office, still laughing, completely unaware that she had just thrown Hank Smith's world into disarray. For the first time in years, he had no idea how to handle a situation. She was a problem, and worse, he was starting to like it. Hank was officially lost after the tie incident, and that damned report that had forced him into physical contact, however brief, with Solene Morris. He could no longer pretend she didn't exist. He had spent 2 decades living in complete control, untouched, unbothered. No one had ever dared to cross that line. It wasn't just a personal boundary. It was a system, a structure he had built to keep himself untouchable. And yet, she had waltzed into his life and shattered it, without even trying. And now, he was making the #1 mistake for a man like him. He was paying attention to her. It was infuriating. Over the past few hours, he had noticed his eyes searching for her even when he didn't mean to. When he passed by the cafeteria, he saw her laughing with colleagues, and for some absurd reason, it irritated him. During a meeting, he caught her biting her lip while concentrating, and his brain, against his will, stored that piece of information. And to his complete frustration, he realized that Solene talked to herself when she thought no one was listening. He had witnessed it earlier. She had been typing at her desk, muttering under her breath. Who designed these ridiculous spreadsheets? Were they created solely to torment assistants? She let out an exasperated sigh, then mumbled, If I mess this up, I bet he'll look at me like I just ruined his entire existence. Hank had raised an eyebrow. Was she talking about him? He shouldn't have cared, but he did. And then it happened. Solene made a small mistake in a financial report. Nothing catastrophic, just a formatting issue, but it was enough to catch his attention. Without hesitation, he pressed the intercom. Solene, in my office, now! There was silence on the other end. Then, a hesitant voice. You mean, right now? Like, right now? Hank closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. That's what I said. 2 minutes later, she entered his office, looking more annoyed than concerned. If you ever summon me like that over the intercom again, I might actually have a heart attack, she warned. Hank ignored her, lifting the report and pointing to the mistake. What is this? Solene tilted her head, frowning. A piece of paper? He rolled his eyes. What's wrong with this piece of paper? She took the sheet from him, scanning it quickly. Hank crossed his arms, waiting. Okay, fine, she admitted with a sigh. I forgot to align the columns in the second chart. But let's be real, Mr. Smith. No one has ever died from a misaligned table. If I wanted chaos, I'd start a tech company and wear flip-flops to work. Hank narrowed his eyes. So, you don't wear flip-flops at home either? She smirked. Do you? He closed his eyes for a second, patience officially depleted. Just fix it, he said flatly. All right. She raised her hands in surrender. No more misaligned tables, I promise. She turned to leave, but before she reached the door, Hank blurted out, Do you always talk to yourself, Solene? She froze mid-step. Slowly she turned to face him. "What? I saw you earlier, mumbling to yourself at your desk. Do you do that often?" Her eyes widened in horror. "You? You saw that?" "Yes." "Oh no!" She covered her face with her hands. "This is terrible." "Why?" "Because I try so hard to seem at least somewhat normal, and now you know I have this flaw?" Hank frowned. "Talking to yourself is a flaw? Isn't it?" She hesitated, peeking at him between her fingers. "Wait. You're not messing with me, are you?" Hank exhaled. "Solene, I don't have time to mess with people. I'm a billionaire CEO." She studied him for a second, then, much to his dismay, burst into laughter. And that was the moment Hank realized something unsettling. For the first time in years, he felt comfortable. She didn't treat him like some untouchable figure. She wasn't intimidated by his power, his rules, or his walls, and without realizing it, he was starting to like that, which meant one thing: he had to stop it. Because if this continued, he would lose control, and Hank Smith never lost control. Hank Smith didn't like distractions. His world was built on structure, precision, and meticulous planning. Everything had a purpose, a place, a rule to follow. But ever since Solene Morris walked into his life, everything felt off. He found himself noticing irrelevant details: how she furrowed her brows when she concentrated, how she absent-mindedly played with her bracelet while reading a document, and, worst of all, the touch. For 2 decades he had avoided physical contact with women. The mere thought of it had always made his body tense, his instincts recoil. But when Solene touched him, nothing happened. No discomfort, no revulsion, no immediate urge to pull away. That thought tormented him more than he cared to admit. He clutched the gold pen in his hand, trying to focus on the multi-million-dollar contract in front of him. But his mind refused to cooperate. Instead, it dragged him back to the past, a past he had spent years burying. 16 years ago, Hank hadn't been the powerful financial mogul he was today. Back then, he had been just a young heir, eager to prove his worth in a world of giants. And like any young and ambitious man, he had believed in love. Her name had been Aurelia. Sweet smile, captivating eyes. He had given her everything: his heart, his trust, his future, until the day he discovered the truth. She hadn't loved him. She had loved his money, his status, his influence. And when a wealthier man came along, she left him without hesitation. The breakup hadn't just hurt. It had humiliated him. He could still hear her voice, cool and detached, as she held his hands and said, "You were never enough." Those words had cut through him like a blade. That was the moment something inside him had shattered. That was when he learned that human touch could deceive, that affection could be a facade, that closeness was a risk. And so he built his rule, he distanced himself, he put up walls. He stopped trusting. For 20 years it had worked. Until Solene Morris. Hank blinked, snapping back to the present. His fingers had tightened around the pen so hard his knuckles were white. His pulse was erratic. This had to stop. He would not let a simple assistant shake the foundation he had built. If Solene had managed to break through his barriers, then he would reinforce them. No more casual moments, no more touching. Determined, he stood and strode toward the door. This needed to end now. Solene was sitting at her desk, casually chewing on a granola bar while reviewing a document on her screen. Everything felt perfectly normal, until she felt a pair of eyes practically boring into her. She looked up. Hank Smith was standing there, looming over her desk with the most severe expression she had ever seen. She almost choked. "Morris," Hank began, crossing his arms. "From now on, we will keep our relationship strictly professional." Solene blinked. "Wait, wasn't that already obvious?" His expression remained firm. No jokes, no touching, no unnecessary proximity. She stared at him, baffled. "Sorry, boss, but unnecessary proximity? We barely talk outside of work. What do you think? Am I trying to seduce you or something?" Hank hadn't expected that response. "I didn't say that," he replied, but her words unsettled him. She was right. He was treating her like a threat, as if she were some kind of unpredictable force in his carefully controlled world. But that was exactly why he had to set boundaries. "Just follow the rules," he said firmly. Solene narrowed her eyes but didn't argue. "Whatever you say, boss." Then she turned back to her computer, resuming her work as if he wasn't even there. Hank remained standing for a few seconds longer, for reasons he couldn't quite explain. And for some infuriating reason, the thought of Solene not paying attention to him anymore bothered him deeply. Before he did something foolish, he left. The next day, Solene decided to respect his strictly professional request. If Hank wanted distance, he would get it. She handed him reports without so much as a glance, kept her tone clipped and formal, and didn't engage in any unnecessary conversation. She did exactly what he wanted, or so she thought, because to her surprise, Hank seemed irritated by it. Throughout the day, she caught him shooting fleeting glances in her direction. His jaw was set tighter than usual. He seemed frustrated, and then something unexpected happened. Late in the afternoon, Hank called her into his office. She walked in only to find him holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to her. "Here." Solene raised an eyebrow. "You bought me coffee?" He looked away. "The barista made a mistake. I grabbed it by accident." She stared at him, biting back a smile. "Oh, right, because baristas always mix up 2 identical orders for the same person." He didn't respond. She smirked, taking the cup. Hank Smith was trying to make amends in his own strange way. Knew just maybe he was more confused than he let on, and that only made things more interesting. That night, Hank Smith realized something far worse than his issues with touch. He realized that no matter how much he tried to avoid it, Solene Morris was already in his head, and there was nothing he could do to change that. Hank Smith despised social events. Gala dinners, business receptions, charity parties, they were all the same. Artificial smiles, empty conversations, and insincere gestures of generosity. But as CEO of Smith Enterprises, his presence was expected. Avoiding these events would only invite speculation. Tonight, he had to attend a charity auction. And to make things worse, he needed a date. Traditionally, CEOs brought companions, business partners, socialites, or fiancés. In Hank's case, none of these options appealed to him, so without thinking too much, he made an impulsive decision. Solene. His assistant looked up from her computer, surprised. "Yes?" He took a deep breath. "I have a charity event tonight. I need a date. You're coming with me." She blinked, stunned. "Excuse me?" "It's a charity auction. A simple event. You just need to attend, remain discreet, and represent the company by my side." Solene crossed her arms, studying him. "So, let me get this straight," she said, tilting her head. "You've spent the past few days making it very clear that you don't want unnecessary closeness, and now you want me to go to an event with you?" Hank kept his posture rigid. "Yes." She let out a dramatic sigh. "Mr. Smith, I don't know if you've noticed, but you're sending very mixed signals." He exhaled impatiently. "Just accept it, Solene. It will be better than taking anyone else." She smirked. "Wow, thanks for the enthusiasm." Ignoring her sarcasm, he turned back to his computer. "Dress appropriately. I'll pick you up at 7. Solene opened her mouth to argue but stopped herself. He wanted to take her to the event. Who was she to refuse? At exactly 7 p.m., Solene was ready. Unlike her usual office attire, tonight she had transformed. Her black thin-strap dress hugged her curves with effortless elegance. Not too extravagant, just right. The silky fabric moved fluidly with her every step, and instead of her usual messy bun, her hair cascaded down her shoulders in soft waves. When Hank arrived dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, he paused for a second when he saw her. Solene raised an eyebrow. "Is there a problem?" He blinked, snapping back to his usual impassive expression. "None." They walked to the car in silence. Minutes later, they arrived at the grand event hall. The atmosphere was drenched in sophistication, glittering chandeliers, classical music floating in the air, champagne flutes clinking against one another as elegantly dressed guests mingled. As they stepped inside, Solene immediately noticed how many eyes were on Hank. She smirked. "You seem very popular here." "Popular isn't the right word." "Oh, right," she teased. "You're the mysterious CEO who doesn't touch women. I bet half these people are trying to figure out how someone convinced you to bring a date." He sighed. "Please, watch your words." She grinned. "But where's the fun in that?" As they conversed, several guests began approaching Hank, exchanging polite greetings. He remained composed, responding with his usual curt professionalism. Solene, on the other hand, observed the interactions with mild amusement, until she noticed an approaching presence that made her instinctively stiffen. A tall blonde woman with piercing eyes strode toward them, her striking red dress clinging to her every movement. There was a precision to her smile, calculated, not warm. "Hank," the woman greeted, her voice laced with cold familiarity. His expression barely shifted. "Aurelia." Solene immediately picked up on the tension between them. This was Aurelia Wright, the woman who had shattered Hank's heart years ago, and judging by the sharp glint in her gaze, their history was far from buried. "I'm surprised to see you here, with a date," Aurelia remarked, her eyes flicking to Solene with veiled scrutiny. Solene saw an opportunity and took it without hesitation. She looped her arm through Hank's, tilting her head playfully as she smiled up at him. "Oh, he's a gentleman. He'd never let me come alone." Hank stiffened, caught off guard by the sudden physical closeness. Aurelia's expression remained unreadable, though. Solene noticed a flicker of something. Irritation, perhaps? "Is that so?" "Well, Hank has always been reserved." Solene offered a sweet, knowing smile. Maybe he was just waiting for the right person to break that reserve. Aurelia studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. As soon as she was out of sight, Hank exhaled slowly, tension still coiled in his posture. That was unnecessary. Solene simply shrugged. "I refuse to let an ex downplay my presence." He narrowed his eyes. "You enjoy causing trouble, don't you?" She smirked. "Let's just say I'm good at leveling the playing field." Hank stared at her longer than he should have. There was something different about her. She wasn't intimidated by him, wasn't cautious around him, and, most surprisingly, wasn't afraid to challenge him. For the first time that night, he realized that maybe having her by his side wasn't so bad. Hours later, when they finally left the event, Solene sank into the car seat with a long, exhausted sigh, longer perhaps than after an entire workday. Hank drove in silence, focused on the road. After a moment, she glanced at him. "So, was the event a success?" He gave a short nod. "Yes. The company's presence was well received. And what about me? Did I pass as an acceptable event companion?" Hank flicked a glance at her before turning his eyes back to the road. "You were tolerable." Solene let out a laugh. "Is that the closest thing to a compliment I'm gonna get?" He didn't respond, but for the first time that night, the corner of his mouth twitched. Almost forming a smile, Solene noticed, and she liked what she saw. When they reached her building, she turned to him before stepping out. "Thanks for taking me." He nodded. "Good night, Solene." She gave him a small smile and slipped out of the car. Hank watched as the door to her building closed behind her. He should have felt relieved that the night was over, but he didn't. And that, more than anything else, left him completely unsettled. Hank Smith couldn't sleep. The digital clock on his bedside table read 2:43 a.m., yet he remained in bed, staring at the ceiling as if the answers to his frustrations were hidden in the dark. But he knew exactly what was bothering him. Solene Morris, tonight, was supposed to be nothing more than a formality. He was supposed to bring her, fulfill his social obligation, and move on without a second thought. Instead, his mind refused to let her go. He kept replaying moments from the night. The way she had effortlessly disarmed Aurelia with that sharp tongue of hers. The way her black dress had moved with effortless grace. The way she had slipped her arm through his as if it was the most natural thing in the world. And worst of all, he hadn't minded. For years, Hank had lived in isolation, avoiding physical contact like it was a landmine. Human touch had always made him uncomfortable, sometimes even repulsed. But with Solene, nothing. No tension, no immediate need to step away. That realization terrified him. Frustrated, he shut his eyes, willing his thoughts to quiet. But the harder he tried to erase her from his mind, the stronger she lingered. With a quiet sigh, he threw off the covers and walked to the kitchen. Maybe a glass of water would help. Or maybe he was simply looking for a distraction from the one thing he couldn't escape. Maybe it was just a fleeting whim. Something meaningless. He just needed to stick to his routine, push aside any stray thoughts about Solene, and move forward. That was all. The next morning, Hank arrived at the office at his usual time. As always, he walked through the lobby with purpose, eyes straight ahead, ignoring the hushed conversations and the way employees straightened in his presence. No one dared to interrupt his path. But then, his gaze landed on her. Solene She was sitting at her desk, finishing the last sip of her coffee, laughing at something Milo Turner had said. That laugh, light, effortless, unguarded, something twisted inside him. Without realizing it, his steps slowed. It was only a fraction of a second, barely perceptible, but Milo noticed. The head of finance sent Hank an amused look, his expression knowing, as if he had just witnessed something significant. "Good morning, Mr. Smith," Milo greeted, his tone carrying the slightest edge of teasing. Hank immediately hardened his expression, quickening his pace. He ignored the remark, but the damage was already done. Solene turned toward him, holding a folder of documents. "Good morning, boss. Ready for another intense day of spreadsheets and meetings?" She extended the folder to him. "Is the report ready?" he asked, keeping his tone clipped. He hesitated for half a second before taking it. The memory of their last touch still lingered in his mind, but before he could pull away, he realized Solene wasn't letting go. Her grip remained firm, forcing him to look her in the eye. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice laced with curiosity. "You seem off today." His jaw tightened. He pulled the folder from her hands with more force than necessary. "I'm perfectly fine," he replied. Solene narrowed her eyes slightly, unconvinced. "If you say so." Then, just like that, she turned back to her computer, dismissing the moment entirely. But Hank stood there for a second longer than he should have. Then, without another word, he walked into his office, shutting the door behind him, trying, and failing, to ignore the fact that Solene Morris could see right through his carefully constructed walls. The day dragged on, slow and frustrating. Hank tried to focus, bury himself in work, drown out the distractions. It didn't work. His mind kept circling back to the past few days. He needed to snap out of this. She was just an assistant, an employee like any other. So why the hell couldn't he stop noticing every little thing about her? By the end of the afternoon, he made a decision. He called Solene into his office. When she walked in, she looked completely at ease, leaning casually against the doorframe, arms crossed, not even slightly intimidated. "Go ahead," she said, waiting. Hank took a steady breath. "From now on, I want to keep all interactions strictly professional. No unnecessary conversations, no jokes." Solene raised an eyebrow. "Are you serious?" "Yes." For a moment, she simply studied him, tilting her head slightly. Then, with a smirk, she said, "So, I assume that also means you'll stop staring at me all the time, right?" Hank stiffened. "I don't." Solene's smirk widened. "Sure, boss." "Stare at you, Solene?" Hank repeated, his tone even. Solene flashed a mischievous smile. "Oh, so it's just a coincidence that every time I look up, your eyes are already on me?" He held his ground, his posture rigid. "You're mistaken." She laughed, shaking her head. "If you say so, boss." She turned to leave, but something tightened inside him, a feeling unfamiliar, unsettling. Before he could think twice, the words slipped out of his mouth without his permission. "Are you free for dinner tonight?" Solene stopped mid-step. Slowly, she turned back, eyes slightly wide. "Wait, what?" Hank cleared his throat. "Dinner, with me." She blinked. "Is this a joke?" "No." She studied him for a moment, her head tilting ever so slightly. "And here I thought you didn't want unnecessary conversations." "It's a business dinner," he said quickly, as if that would make it more acceptable. "Of course it is," she smirked. And at that moment, Hank knew he had already lost this battle. 2 hours later, Hank and Solene sat across from each other in an elegant restaurant. Solene skimmed the menu, feigning an impressed expression. "Wow, even the prices here seem arrogant." Hank said nothing. She glanced up at him. "So, is this how you always invite someone to dinner? No explanation, no warning?" He set his menu down. "I figured you wouldn't say no," she laughed. "And I didn't. I'm just surprised." The waiter arrived, taking their orders, and once he left, Solene leaned slightly forward, resting her elbows on the table. "So, why did you bring me here, Hank?" He hesitated. "I told you, it's a business dinner." "Liar." She raised an eyebrow. "You didn't bring me here for business. You're trying to test something." Hank went completely still. Solene smiled knowingly. "I saw your face at the event last night. You're trying to figure out what changed." She rested her chin on her hand, studying him. "What happened to you?" Hank didn't answer, because for the first time, he had no answer. And worse, he wasn't sure if he even wanted one. When the night ended, Hank drove her home. He pulled up to her building, parking in silence. Solene smiled. "I'll admit, that was a nice dinner." Hank kept his hands on the steering wheel, his mind tangled with thoughts he didn't know how to unravel. Solene turned to him, sensing something unspoken lingering in the air. Then finally he voiced the question that had been tormenting him for days. "What did you do to me?" Solene froze for a fraction of a second, just enough for him to notice. Then, a small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. Nothing. She opened the door and stepped out, disappearing into the building without another word. Hank sat there alone, gripping the wheel, her answer echoing in his mind. But he knew. No matter how much she insisted that she hadn't done anything, the truth was much simpler. Solene Morris had changed everything. And now he had no idea what to do about it. Hank Smith had never felt so out of control. In the days following their dinner, he tried everything to regain his usual routine. He buried himself in work, reviewed reports, closed deals, maintained distance, but nothing worked. Each passing day it became increasingly obvious, something inside him had shifted. Behead, everything had been simple. He arrived at the office, managed operations, left without caring about anyone beyond what was necessary. Now he found himself searching for Solene in the hallways, unconsciously listening for her laughter, sensing her presence before he even saw her. And worst of all, whenever she got close, his body reacted in ways it never had before. His heart beat just a fraction faster. His breathing subtly changed. He noticed things about her, tiny details he shouldn't care about. The way she twirled a pen when she was thinking. The way her lips pursed slightly when she read an email she didn't like. The way she always tilted her head when she was about to say something sarcastic. It was dangerous. She was becoming a distraction. And Hank Smith couldn't afford distractions. He needed to fix this. Before it was too late. By mid-afternoon, Hank was in the conference room, reviewing a contract, when he heard a familiar sound. A laugh. Solene, he knew it was her before he even looked. Her laughter was light, effortless, full of life, so unlike the rigid, serious atmosphere of the office. And yet, somehow it made everything feel a little less monotonous. His eyes drifted toward the glass wall. There she was, talking to Milo Turner, and for some reason, the sight of it bothered him more than it should have. Milo was leaning in slightly, saying something that made her laugh again. Hank clenched his jaw. Why the hell am I feeling this? Jealousy? Impossible, he never got jealous, ever. And yet there he was, watching them, feeling an irritation that made no sense. Before he even realized it, he was on his feet, walking straight toward them. "Solene?" His voice came out sharper than he intended. She turned toward him with a bright smile, one that instantly faded when she saw his expression. "Yes, boss. I need to talk to you, now." Milo raised an eyebrow, smirking slightly as if he knew exactly what was happening. "Well, I guess that's my cue to leave," he said, giving Solene a wink before walking off. Hank hated that. Solene crossed her arms, watching him carefully. "What's the problem?" He didn't answer right away because he didn't know. He had called her over on impulse without a real reason, and now he was stuck standing there looking like an idiot. Solene tilted her head, studying him. "Hank, are you okay?" Hank blinked, as if only now realizing how ridiculous he was acting. He exhaled sharply, frustration curling in his chest. "Forget it! Get back to work!" He turned to leave. And then, a touch. Soft. Barely there, but enough to freeze him in place. Her fingers brushed against his wrist. Light, hesitant. He looked down at where she was touching him, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Hank," she said gently, "can you be honest with me? What's going on?" He couldn't tell her because he didn't even know. So he did what he did best. He pulled away. "Nothing," his voice was clipped. "Get back to work." And with that he walked off without looking back, but it was already too late. Her touch was still burning on his skin. In the days that followed, Hank did everything in his power to avoid Solene. He delegated more tasks to his team. He avoided walking past her department. He forced himself not to look when he knew she was near, but none of it worked. Because the more he tried to avoid her, the more she seemed to be everywhere. He stepped into the elevator. Solene was there. He went to grab coffee. Solene was already at the cafe. He stayed late at the office. Solene was leaving at the exact same time. It was as if the universe was mocking him. And then, she confronted him. Solene knocked on his office door, and before he could even respond, she walked in. Hank had known this was coming sooner or later. She shut the door behind her and crossed her arms. "Enough, Hank, what's going on?" His expression remained neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, you don't?" She arched a brow. "Then why have you been avoiding me?" He didn't answer. Solene let out an exasperated sigh. "If this is about that night at dinner, just say it. Did I do something wrong? No? Then why are you acting like I'm some kind of threat?" Hank ran a hand over his face, the weight of his exhaustion settling deep in his bones. "Solene, it's nothing, just forget it." She studied him for a long moment. Then slowly, a knowing smile spread across her lips. "Hank," she murmured, stepping closer, "are you afraid of me?" His eyes snapped to hers instantly. "Don't be ridiculous," she smirked. "Then prove it." And then she took another step closer. Hank didn't move. "If you really feel nothing," Solene murmured, her voice light yet challenging, "then there's no reason to be uncomfortable, right?" She took another step closer. His heartbeat kicked up a notch. Then she raised her hand and lightly touched his wrist. It was nothing, just a simple touch, barely there, but to Hank it felt like an electric shock. Solene smiled. "See? You're nervous." Hank immediately pulled his arm back. "That means nothing." "Of course not," she laughed. "You're just pale as a sheet, like a teenager who just got kissed for the first time." He didn't find it funny. "Stop this." "No," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "Because I know there's something here." She studied him closely, as if she could see right through him. "And I'm going to figure out what it is." Hank didn't respond. He couldn't. Because at that moment he realized she was right. There was something there, something he wasn't ready to face. And no matter how much he tried to deny it, he knew. He wouldn't be able to avoid it for much longer. Hank Smith was reaching his limit. For days he had tried every possible tactic to ignore the fact that Solene Morris was becoming his biggest distraction. Nothing worked. Avoiding her only made the urge to look at her stronger. Pretending not to care only made him more irritated. And now, to make things worse, Solene knew something had shifted in him, and that made her an even bigger problem. She had started pushing him, testing his boundaries. Touching his wrist without hesitation, teasing his discomfort, making him feel things he shouldn't feel. He didn't want to give her that power, but at the same time, he couldn't pretend he wasn't affected anymore. Then came the final blow. That night, there was a corporate event, an exclusive rooftop gathering at one of the city's most luxurious hotels. He knew Solene would be there. Her job required it, but he wasn't prepared for what he saw the moment he arrived. His eyes immediately found her. Solene wore a deep wine-colored dress, elegant, perfectly fitted, with an open-back design that revealed just enough her hair. Hair fell in soft waves, and the smile she gave to those around her was bright, effortless, too easy. Hank hated the way he felt when he saw her like that. He didn't know exactly what it was, but if he had to put it into words, possessiveness, and that was dangerous, very dangerous. The night dragged on. Hank kept his composure, greeting investors, discussing business, avoiding Solene's presence whenever possible. But every time he glanced around the room, there she was, laughing, talking to someone, shining like she was meant to be the center of attention. And then, he saw something that crossed the line. Solene was standing at the bar, talking to Nash Carter. Hank knew Nash well. Charming, smooth, a businessman with a reputation for being a little too good with women. And then, Nash placed his hand on Solene's waist. Something inside Hank snapped. Before he could think, before he could rationalize, he was already moving. Solene was laughing at something Nash had said when she suddenly felt a presence beside her. Before she could react, a firm grip wrapped around her arm. She turned. "Hank?" Nash raised an amused eyebrow. "Well, if it isn't Hank Smith. Are you interrupting something?" Hank ignored him. His gaze was fixed solely on Solene. "I need to talk to you. Now." She blinked, confused. "We're in the middle of a conversation. Can it wait a minute?" Hank didn't answer. He only tightened his hold slightly, just enough for her to feel the tension in his touch. Nash chuckled, clearly entertained. "Relax, Hank. I wasn't going to steal your girl." Solene's eyes widened. "What? No!" But Hank was already pulling her away. He led her to a more secluded corner of the rooftop, away from prying eyes. The moment they stopped, Solene yanked her arm free and crossed her arms. "What is your problem?" Hank ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. He clenched his jaw. Solene narrowed her eyes. "You what?" He hesitated, then finally the word slipped out. "I didn't like him touching you." She blinked. "So what?" "It was just a casual touch." His eyes met hers, dark, unwavering. "I didn't like it." For a second she said nothing, then slowly, a teasing smile curved on her lip. "Hank," she murmured, stepping closer. "Are you jealous?" He swallowed hard. "No." She tilted her head. "Then what's the reason for all this?" He had no answer. Solene studied him carefully. Then she took another step, closing the space between them. "Tell me the truth." Hank could smell her perfume now, soft, intoxicating. "There's no truth," he muttered, his voice lower than before. She lifted an eyebrow. "So if I did it again, with another man, you wouldn't care?" Hank closed his eyes for a brief second. Then, before he could stop himself, he grabbed the back of her neck and kissed her. Fast. Intense. No hesitation. Solene froze for a split second, caught off guard. Then she kissed him back, gripping the lapels of his jacket, pulling him closer. The world around them blurred. The noise of the party faded. All that existed was this, her lips, his touch, the undeniable force between them. Hank was the first to pull away. He opened his eyes slowly, his breath uneven, and met her gaze, wide-eyed, surprised, breathless. And then reality slammed into him. "This should never have happened," he said, his voice suddenly cold. Solene blinked, the moment still hanging heavy in the air. He took a step back. "It was a mistake." Her expression hardened. "So you kiss me like that, and now you decide it was a mistake?" Hank didn't know how to respond. He could still taste her on his lips, his body still burned where she had touched him. But he couldn't let this go any further. He wouldn't. "I mean it, Solene. Forget it." She let out a short, sarcastic laugh. "Hank, you are unbelievable." He turned to leave, but before he could take more than 2 steps, her hand was on his arm again. "Don't run." He stopped, but he didn't look at her. She stepped closer, her voice softer but unwavering. "You kissed me, Hank. You pulled me in. And now you want to pretend it didn't happen?" His jaw clenched. He closed his eyes for a moment, willing himself to regain control. Then, without turning around, he forced out the only words he could manage. "It was just an impulse. That's all." Silence. Hank felt the weight of it, the tension in the air, the energy shifting between them. Then she let go. "All right," she murmured, but there was no anger in her voice, only determination. "If that's how you want to play this, then we'll play it that way." And in that moment, Hank knew. He hadn't pushed her away. If anything, he had just made things even more dangerous. And now, he had nowhere left to run. Hank Smith was losing control. In the days following the kiss, he did everything in his power to pretend it never happened. He ignored Solene at the office, buried himself in meetings, contracts, anything to keep his mind occupied. He created even more professional distance, avoiding eye contact, keeping their interactions brief and formal. None of it worked, because every time he closed his eyes, he could still taste her on his lips. Every time he heard her laugh somewhere in the office, he remembered the warmth of her body against his. And every time she walked past him without even glancing his way, something tightened in his chest. She was playing dirty. No confrontation, no questions, no demands for an explanation. She simply acted like he didn't exist. And it was killing him, a little more each day. By Friday night, Hank had reached his limit. He needed out. He wasn't much of a drinker, but tonight, he didn't want to think. So he went to an upscale bar in the city center, a discreet spot where CEOs and executives came to unwind after exhausting weeks. He ordered a whiskey, took a seat in the farthest corner of the room, and nursed his drink, glass in hand, mindful of thoughts he shouldn't be having. Things were already bad, and then they got worse, because the moment Hank leaned back in his chair, bringing his whiskey to his lips, she walked in, Solene, and she wasn't alone. Beside her, looking completely at ease, was Milo Turner. Hank felt his blood boil. He didn't know what was worse, the fact that she was here in the same bar as him, or the fact that she was with another man. Worse yet, Milo was sharp. He knew exactly what he was doing, and no matter how much Hank tried to pretend he didn't care, he did. He hated the idea of Solene with someone else. She hadn't noticed him yet, but then, as if she could feel his gaze, she lifted her eyes. For a moment, silence stretched between them as their eyes met across the dimly lit bar. Hank's body went rigid. Solene held the eye contact for a beat longer than necessary. Then, to his complete and utter frustration, she smiled and turned her attention back to Milo, as if Hank wasn't even there. Hank gripped his glass tightly, his jaw clenching. She was playing against him, and she was winning. 10 minutes later, Hank had had enough. He wasn't going to sit there pretending not to care while Solene laughed and talked with Milo Turner as if he didn't exist. Before he could overthink it, he was already standing up, already moving toward her. Milo noticed him first. "Ah, Hank," he said, smirking. "What are you doing here?" Hank didn't respond. His eyes were locked on her. "Can we talk?" Solene raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Now?" she echoed. "Now!" Hank felt his patience slipping. 5 minutes, that's all I need." Solene let out an exaggerated sigh and glanced at Milo. "Do you mind?" Milo shrugged. "As long as he doesn't kidnap you, go ahead." Solene smiled as she stood up. "All right, then." 5 minutes later, they stood in a quieter corner of the bar. Solene crossed her arms, watching him expectantly. "Well?" she prompted. "What was so important?" Hank didn't know where to start. He looked at her, trying to find the right words, trying not to sound as desperate as he felt, but then she tilted her head and smiled. "Hank," she murmured, "are you jealous?" A sharp jolt ran through him, like an electric shock. He couldn't deny it, but he couldn't admit it either. "Don't be ridiculous." Solene raised an eyebrow. "Then why are you here, pulling me away from my date?" His fists clenched. "This is not a date." "Oh?" she smirked. "And you get to decide who I go out with now?" Hank didn't answer. Because he didn't know how. Solene stepped closer, eyes gleaming with something dangerous. "Tell me the truth, Hank." He didn't know. Or rather, he did. But he couldn't say it. So instead, he acted. Before he could stop himself, his hand slid to the back of her neck, and he kissed her. This time, it wasn't an impulse. It was surrender. Solene responded immediately. Her fingers curled into the lapels of his jacket, pulling him closer. The kiss was deeper, more certain. Their lips moved together, their breaths mixing, the world around them dissolving into nothing. The bar, the people, nothing existed but them. When they finally pulled apart, Hank saw it in her eyes. Nothing would ever be the same. "Is this still a mistake?" Solene asked, breathless. Hank exhaled, running a hand over his face, frustration warring with something he wasn't ready to name. "Yes," Solene laughed, shaking her head. "Well, I don't think so. He should have walked away, should have put distance between them, should have done something to regain control, but instead, he kissed her again. That, no hesitation, no barriers, no lies, just him, just her, and the undeniable, inescapable desire they could no longer ignore. Solene matched his intensity. She clutched his shirt tightly, as if she had no intention of letting him go, as if she had finally gotten what she wanted all along. When they pulled apart, breathless, Hank didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Solene smiled, something twisted inside him. He no longer knew what was right or wrong, only that he couldn't fight this anymore. In the days that followed, everything changed. Hank tried to act as if nothing had happened. He forced himself to keep his usual professional stance, to show nothing. But for the first time, Solene wouldn't let him. She was everywhere, walking just a little too close in the hallways, locking eyes with him in meetings, as if she knew exactly what he was trying to hide. Hank realized he was at a disadvantage because, unlike him, Solene wasn't afraid to admit what she wanted. And with each passing day, he was losing the battle. He was giving in. On Friday morning, he arrived at his office and found a cup of coffee sitting on his desk. He frowned. "What is this?" Solene smiled from her desk. "A coffee? Why?" "Because I wanted to." He looked at her, trying to make sense of the gesture. Solene just kept smiling, and then Hank realized he was smiling too. He couldn't deny it anymore. She affected him in a way no one ever had before, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to run from it. That night, Hank sat in his apartment, trying to work, trying and failing to focus. Then, a notification. A message. I'm outside your building. Are you going to invite me up, or are you going to keep pretending nothing is happening? Hank's heart slammed against his ribs. He could ignore it, he could pretend, but he didn't want to. So he answered, "Come up." Minutes later, Solene stood in front of him. She was dressed casually, jeans and a black top, but to Hank, she had never looked more beautiful. She crossed her arms, smirking. "You're not that hard to break, you know." Hank just watched her, then, finally, he did what he had wanted to do since day one. He pulled her close and kissed her. This time without hesitation, without fear. The spark between them ignited into fire. Hank pulled her in tighter, his hands sliding over her back, finally allowing himself to feel everything he had been denying. Solene didn't hold back. She had wanted this for so long. Him, without walls, without resistance. His apartment was silent, but between them the air was charged. Hank knew he should stop, but he couldn't. The feel of her skin beneath his fingertips, her scent, the way her lips fit perfectly against his. It was too much. Then Solene's hands moved over his chest, reaching for the buttons of his shirt, and Hank jerked back. Instinctive, automatic, as if he had been burned. Solene looked at him, confused. "What's wrong?" Hank ran a hand through his hair, exhaling deeply, struggling to find the right words. But there were no right words. "I'm not ready," he admitted. "Not yet." Solene studied him carefully. Then, "Do you want me to leave?" Something inside him twisted painfully. The thought of her walking away gutted him, but he didn't know how to move forward either. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. "I think this was a mistake." Solene went still. Neither of them spoke. Then she laughed, but it wasn't amusement. It was disbelief. "A mistake," she repeated, shaking her head. "Seriously, Hank?" He didn't answer. Her expression shifted, disappointment settling in. "You know what? I should have expected this." She grabbed her bag and headed for the door. Then, right before leaving, she glanced over her shoulder. "You can't run from this forever, Hank." And then she was gone. Hank stood there alone, the silence of his apartment pressing in around him, but it wasn't really silent, not when the echo of her still filled the space. Solene's voice, her touch, her presence lingered like a ghost, one he wasn't sure he wanted to exorcise. And for the first time, Hank Smith felt truly lost. In the days that followed, he buried himself in work. If he had been reserved before, now he was practically a ghost in his own office. He avoided Solene at all costs. If he stepped into the elevator and saw her there, he walked out before the doors closed. If she entered the conference room, he found a reason to leave before they were alone. But he knew this couldn't last forever, and he was right. It was late at night when Solene finally cornered him. Hank had just left the office when he saw her standing by his car, arms crossed, waiting, determined. His first instinct was to turn around, go back inside, avoid her. But he knew she wouldn't let this go. With a sigh, he walked toward her. "Solene, what are you doing here?" She raised an eyebrow. "Waiting for you to stop acting like an idiot." His expression hardened. "It's not that simple." "Yes, it is. You're just making it complicated." Hank unlocked the car, but before he could open the door, her hand covered his. The touch was soft but electric. His body froze. She stepped closer. "Tell me the truth, Hank." He tried to pull away. She held firm. "Do you want me?" she asked, her voice steady. "Yes or no?" Hank shut his eyes. Then, he told the truth. "Yes." Solene smiled, like she had just won, but then, he hesitated. "What if I mess this up?" She laughed softly. "You already are." Hank exhaled heavily. Then, he made his decision. He grabbed her and kissed her. This time, he didn't pull away. No fear, no hesitation, no intention of letting her go. Solene responded instantly, gripping the collar of his shirt, pulling him closer, like she had finally gotten exactly what she wanted from the start. Then, thunder rumbled in the sky. They pulled apart just enough to glance up at the storm clouds rolling in. Solene laughed, her hands still fisted in his shirt. "Looks like the universe wants to make this scene even more dramatic." Hank glanced up at the darkening sky, then back at her. "Get in the car." Solene studied him for a moment, then she smiled and obeyed. The first few minutes inside the car were silent. Solene watched him, waiting. Hank, on the other hand, was still processing what he had just done. He had kissed her again, and this time he couldn't pretend it was a mistake, because it wasn't. It was the most right thing he had done in years. Solene leaned back in her seat, crossing her arms. "So," she drawled, "is this the part where you run again?" Hank didn't look away. "No," she smiled. "Good, because I was getting tired of that." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. "I'm not good at this." Solene tilted her head. "Good at what?" He hesitated. "Relationships," Solene laughed. "Neither am I, but I don't think that's a problem." Hank looked at her. "What if I mess everything up?" She met his gaze, unwavering. "Then we'll fix it." Hank had never met anyone like her, someone who wasn't afraid, someone who didn't pull away, and for the first time, he wanted to believe her. Maybe, just maybe, he could stop running too. In the days that followed, everything changed, and yet nothing changed. They were still Hank Smith and Solene Morris, boss and assistant CEO and employee. But now, there was something more. Their glances lingered a little longer. Their touches were more frequent, even if subtle. And above all, there was an unspoken tension between them. Solene loved testing his limits. Once, during a meeting, she deliberately dropped a pen near him. As she bent down to pick it up, she whispered just loud enough for him to hear. "You're looking at me, Hank." But inside, he felt it. She challenged him constantly. And the worst part, he liked it. But Hank still wasn't fully ready. He kept their relationship a secret, never talked about it, never made it official. And Solene noticed. One Friday night, while they were having dinner at his apartment, she finally brought it up. "How long are we going to keep this up?" Hank looked at her, confused. "Keep what up?" Solene put down her fork and crossed her arms. "You know what I mean. You act like we're together, but at the same time you keep everything so quiet." She narrowed her eyes. "It's like we're hiding a crime." Hank didn't answer right away, because he knew she was right, but he didn't know how to change it. Solene studied him. Then, carefully, she asked, "Hank, are you ashamed of me?" His eyes widened. "What? No." "Then why does it feel like you're afraid to admit we're together?" Hank exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "It's not that," he muttered. I've never done this before." Solene was quiet for a moment. Then, gently, she asked, "Are you afraid of losing me?" Hank felt the weight of those words. Because yes, he was afraid. Afraid of getting attached, afraid of opening up, afraid of trusting, and being left behind again. Solene reached across the table and took his hand. "Hank," she said softly, "I'm not Aurelia." His breath caught. Solene held his gaze. "I'm not her," she whispered. "I won't walk away when things get hard, but you have to let me in." Hank felt something crack inside him, because he wanted to believe her, but he wasn't sure if he could, and that terrified him more than anything. Hank stood in his office, staring at the door that had just slammed shut behind her. Solene was gone, and for the first time he felt the full weight of what he had done. He had spent years building walls, keeping people at a distance, convincing himself that control was the only way to survive. But now, as the silence wrapped around him like a suffocating force, he realized something terrifying. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life. In the days that followed, Hank became even more distant, not intentionally, but because he was handling all of this the wrong way. And Solene noticed. She didn't push him, she didn't chase him, but she didn't like it. And on a Wednesday afternoon, everything exploded. The tension had been brewing all day. Solene was called into a meeting with Hank and the company's other executives. Throughout the entire discussion, he barely looked at her, acted like nothing had ever happened between them, and that was the last straw. As soon as the meeting ended, Solene followed him into his office and shut the door behind her. Hank turned around, surprised. "What is it, Solene?" She didn't waste time. "What do you want from me, Hank?" His brows furrowed. "What are you talking about? Do you want me, yes or no?" Silence. She stepped closer. "Because if you don't, then tell me now. But if you do, then stop treating me like a stranger in front of everyone else." Hank felt a tightness in his chest. He knew he had to make a choice, but he still wasn't ready, so he made a mistake. "Maybe it's best if we end this," Solene froze. For a long, agonizing second, she said nothing. Then, she laughed, but there was no amusement in it, only bitterness. "Congratulations, Hank, you got what you wanted." And then, she walked away. This time, Hank didn't stop her. And that was the moment he lost her. At first, Hank tried to convince himself he had done the right thing, that keeping his distance was the most rational choice. But then came the silence. And for the first time in a long time, he realized just how unbearable that silence was. Solene, on the other hand, refused to dwell on it. She was tired of waiting for Hank to admit what he felt, tired of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. So the next day she moved on, or at least she tried to, but ignoring Hank wasn't easy. He was everywhere. In meetings, in the hallways, and every time she saw him, she could feel his eyes on her. Yet, this time, she didn't look back. She was determined to live her life without him. And Hank didn't know how to handle that. In the days that followed, Hank became a different man. On the outside, he was still the same ruthless, disciplined CEO, but inside, he was a mess. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat properly, and worst of all, he couldn't stop thinking about her. His apartment felt empty without her presence. The office felt cold without her teasing, and then it hit him like a tidal wave. He no longer knew how to live without Solene Morris. But Solene wasn't going to wait for him. On Friday night, she went out with friends. Hank only found out by chance, a picture on social media. She was at a bar, smiling, holding a colorful drink in her hand, and next to her, a man. Hank couldn't breathe properly. This wasn't just jealousy, it was panic. Because for the first time, he realized that she could actually move on without him. And he wasn't ready for that. That same night, he went after her. He had never done anything so irrational in his entire life, but he didn't care. When he walked into the bar and saw her, laughing, enjoying herself completely unbothered by his absence, he knew he had to do something. He couldn't let her go, so he walked straight to her. Solene noticed him instantly. She didn't hide her surprise, but she didn't look happy to see him. "What are you doing here?" Hank didn't answer. Because he didn't know how. Then, Solene narrowed her eyes. "Oh, I see." Her voice dripped with sarcasm. "You push me away, and now you show up stalking me?" Hank felt a sharp twist in his stomach. "I need to talk to you," he said. Solene let out a sharp laugh, crossing her arms. "No," Hank froze. "Solene, please." "Oh, now you say please?" she snapped. "Where was that humility when you tossed me aside like I was a problem?" Hank had no answer. Solene took a deep breath and grabbed her purse. "You know what?" She shook her head. "Let's just get this over with. Say what you need to say." Hank hesitated. But he knew he couldn't run anymore, so he said the only thing that mattered. "I love you." Solene froze. Hank had never felt so vulnerable in his life. "What?" she asked, like she wasn't sure she had heard him right. Hank took a deep breath. "I love you." Solene didn't say a word. Then, she laughed, but it was nervous laughter. "Really?" She shook her head in disbelief. "Now you decide to tell me this?" Hank's heart pounded. "I know. I'm messed up. I know I hurt you, but Solene cut him off. "Hank, I waited so long to hear that." She sighed, looking at him. But now, she met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I don't know if I still want to." Hank felt his chest tighten. Solene smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. "If you really love me," she whispered, "you'll have to prove it." And then, she walked away. This time, he knew he had to chase after her, because if he didn't, he would lose her. And Hank Smith was not willing to lose Solene Morris. He had made every mistake possible, pushed her away, run from his own feelings, refused to admit the truth. But now, watching her walk away, knowing she might actually be gone for good, he realized something terrifying. He didn't exist without her. Solene Morris was the only thing in his life that made sense, and he was going to prove it. The next morning, Solene sat at her desk, trying to focus on work when she heard a commotion. Murmurs, whispers, people turning around, some holding up their phones as if they were recording something. She frowned. "What's going on?" she asked Milo, who was staring down the hallway looking thoroughly entertained. Surprised, he smirked. "I think your boss has lost his mind, but not like usual." He wasn't in his perfectly tailored suit. He didn't look serious or intimidating. He was barefoot, holding a massive bouquet of flowers, and his suit completely disheveled. Solene nearly choked on her coffee. Hank looked nervous, uncomfortable, but determined. And then he stopped right in front of her desk and knelt down. The entire office froze. Solene stared at him, speechless. No one breathed. And then Hank spoke. Solene Morris. He swallowed hard, looked up at her like a man who had never been this vulnerable in his entire life. I was an idiot, a complete, absolutely ridiculous idiot. Someone in the back muttered, "That's true." Hank shot them a deadly glare, then turned back to her. I ran because I was scared. Because I've never felt anything like this before. Because you, Solene, he exhaled. You did something no one else ever has. Solene still wasn't sure if this was real or if she had hit her head and was hallucinating, but Hank kept going. You made me feel. And now, he took a deep breath. I don't want to run anymore. I don't want to spend another second without you, because without you, nothing makes sense. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small box. Solene's eyes widened. Hank opened it. Inside, a diamond engagement ring sparkled under the light. His voice was rough, unsteady, but sure. So, Solene Morris, a lopsided, nervous smile, will you marry me and put up with me for the rest of your life, even though I'm the most stubborn, difficult man on the planet? The office erupted. Murmurs of laughter. Milo whistled. Solene felt tears sting her eyes. And then, something unexpected happened. She laughed. Because this was so ridiculously perfect. So perfect, in fact, that she couldn't believe this was the same man who had run from her for so long. She looked at him, really looked at him, kneeling there like he had never been more sure of anything in his life. Her heart overflowed. So, she smiled and said, "Of course. I'll marry you, you idiot." Hank let out a relieved laugh, slipped the ring onto her finger, and the moment she looked at him again, he kissed her, right there in the middle of the office, in front of everyone, and no one had ever seen Hank Smith so happy. Months later, Solene still couldn't believe it was real. She stood in front of the mirror, wearing a stunning wedding dress, trying to process the fact that in just a few minutes, she would become Hank Smith's wife. His wife? If someone had told her this months ago, she would have laughed. But now, looking at her reflection, she knew that everything had happened exactly the way it was meant to. The door opened, and Milo stepped inside. "You ready?" he asked. Solene took a deep breath, smiled, and nodded. More than ever. At the altar, Hank Smith had been in countless high-stakes business meetings. He had closed billion-dollar deals, had stood in front of ruthless investors, had never lost his composure. But standing at the altar, waiting for her, he was more nervous than he had ever been in his life. He had never liked ceremonies, never liked being the center of attention. But the moment he saw Solene walking down the aisle, he forgot how to breathe. She was perfect. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid, because he knew this was what he wanted. And when he took her hand, he whispered, "You look absolutely stunning." Solene smiled, "And you're sweating." Hank chuckled, shaking his head slightly, and then the wedding began. The vows were emotional. Solene somehow managed to make him laugh and cry at the same time. And when it was finally time to say "I do," Hank didn't hesitate. Not even for a second, because for the first time in his life he was absolutely certain of what he wanted. And what he wanted was her. The reception. The night was unforgettable. Milo gave a speech that had half the guests laughing until they cried, and Solene, of course, dragged Hank onto the dance floor, even though he insisted he didn't know how to dance, even though he grumbled about it the entire time. But the moment she wrapped her arms around his neck and smiled up at him, he stopped resisting, stopped caring if he looked ridiculous, because for her, he would dance. The fireworks. At the end of the night, they stood together, watching the sky explode with color. Hank pulled Solene into a tight embrace, holding her close against his chest. She sighed, content, resting her head against him. Then, softly, he murmured, I never thought I'd be able to have this." Solene tilted her head up, eyes searching his. "Have what?" she asked. His voice was quiet, full of something raw and real. "Someone like you." Solene smiled. Then she kissed him, soft, certain forever. "Well," she whispered, "get used to it, because now," she grinned, "you're stuck with me." Hank chuckled, shaking his head. And for the first time in his life, he didn't want to run, he only wanted to stay, forever. What did you think of Hank and Solene's story? Did their journey make you laugh, cry, or scream at your screen? Let us know in the comments. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What's your score? And if you loved this romance as much as we did, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another emotional story.